Are you ready for World War III? The chairman of NATO's military committee says the U.S., Canadian, and European alliance is ready for a direct fight with Russia.
Russia's considerable military buildup is unjustified, unexplained, and deeply concerning.
The West is growing increasingly worried that a mass buildup of Russian troops around Ukraine could easily tip from saber rattling into all-out war.
Since the Cold War, Russia is portrayed as the enemy of the Western world. In video games like Battlefield, you play as the United States against the Russians. And in movies, the Russians are often the bad guys. I am a bit of a history geek, so I understand where this sentiment is coming from. Decades of a Cold War isn't exactly the best thing for a relationship. The West and Russia have been throwing rocks at each other since the end of the Second World War, but both countries are smart enough to not attack each other directly, because they understand, just like the rest of the world, where that would lead to: global nuclear damnation. Because they can't attack each other directly, Russia and NATO do the only thing they can do. And no, it's not leaving each other alone. If you're in primary school and you can't bully the kid that you hate because, well, then the entire school dies, then you would just have to find some other kids to bully your enemy for you. Sure, the other kid probably can't defeat your enemy, but they can annoy them. Russia did this with the Vietnam and Korean War by providing North Vietnam and North Korea with military equipment and economic aid, and NATO is currently doing this in Ukraine.
First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance.
For a long time, the war between Russia and Ukraine seemed to be stuck in a stalemate, with both sides suffering a lot of casualties. But because of the latest developments on the front,
in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kyiv has, over the last week, flipped the script on Moscow, with an audacious incursion into southern Russia, catching Moscow by surprise and sowing chaos.
So it's actually a very small enclave, but it's important because it's affecting the way the rest of the war is going further south. That's what the Ukrainians intend out of this.
Russia is putting more and more resources into trying to contain this offensive.
And Ukraine now fighting on Russian soil, one has to wonder, is Russia really that strong? Or has its strength been an illusion all along? If NATO ever has a direct war with Russia, could they win? Now, this subject is a bit complicated to say the least. The internet is flooded with propaganda. Most of the sources do not fit the criteria to be a reliable source. So that leaves me with numbers. First, we analyze NATO's army size. But before we do, we have to check the relations of the countries that are part of NATO. Because there's one country that isn't on Russia's unfriendly list, and that country is Turkey. Now, Turkey has the second largest army in NATO, but I don't think they would fight Russia in a direct war with NATO. There is substantial evidence that they're currently supplying Russia with chemicals and microchips that could be used in a Russian war effort. And although I think Turkey wouldn't pick Russia's side, I do think they would refuse having a direct confrontation with their Russian trade partners. So for that reason, I will exclude Turkey's army in my analysis. That leaves us with a combined NATO force of 3 million active soldiers, 3 million reserve forces, and 650,000 paramilitary forces. They also have 21,000 total aircraft, including 3,000 fighter-type aircraft and 8,000 ground attack aircraft, around 9,000 tanks, and roughly 800,000 armored vehicles. Another 11,000 artillery-related vehicles or equipment, and last but not least, a formidable navy with around 21,000 different kinds of ships, including the big boy ships like the destroyer and frigates. In almost every sector, NATO outnumbers Russia. Russia, as compared to NATO, only 1.3 million active soldiers, 2 million reserve soldiers, and 250,000 paramilitary soldiers. It has only 5,000 aircraft, including 800 fighter types, and 730 ground attack aircraft. Russia does have more tanks and artillery than NATO, with a gigantic 15,000 battle tanks and 14,500 artillery-related vehicles or equipment. Its navy is unsurprisingly also smaller, with around 780 ships. But Russia will not be fighting this war alone. It will be joined by its allies, Belarus, Iran and North Korea. And although China is compelled to join the war on the Russian side, they'll probably refrain from joining direct combat and only support the Russian forces with military equipment and financial aid. The biggest confrontation will happen in Eastern Europe. Russia's biggest advantage will be that its entire society is already geared for war. The factories are manufacturing weapons and its people are used to a herd economy. With the already weakened state of their army because of the war in Ukraine, a big offensive won't be possible. But they will take Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia without suffering too many casualties. As NATO forces on the European continent will start to prepare for their first offensive, they will have to try to stop Russia at the Polish border. NATO has one big disadvantage, and that is the Pacific Ocean that separates the United States from its European allies. Nearly 70% of NATO's power is because of the United States. That isn't strange, considering the United States spent $916 billion on the military alone in the past year. It would take the United States around 48 to 72 hours to get boots on the ground, starting with the airborne divisions. After 1 to 2 weeks, the first major ground forces will arrive, with heavy equipment like artillery and tanks arriving 1 to 2 weeks later. Until then, NATO's mission will be to defend the Polish and Ukrainian border. While NATO might have air superiority, the Russians have a formidable anti-air defense, making it no easy task to push the Russians back. But when the Americans arrive, the first offensive can begin. Of course, the first objective would be taking back Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, while also taking over Belarus. For fear of nuclear escalation, NATO wouldn't dare to invade on Russian soil. Their only option is containing Russia and straining the country's resources. But with China supplying Russia, this conflict could go on for a long time. While both sides suffer casualties, it looks like NATO is winning because the use of its superior navy and air force. All parties involved are losing significant resources, with the United States focusing on the war with Russia. Meanwhile in Asia, the Allied forces present are busy containing North Korea and keeping them out of South Korea. China is also supplying their North Korean allies with as much as equipment they can afford. And while the Allied forces are occupied with fighting North Korea, China decides to invade Taiwan. They know that the United States can't afford to have an all-out war with both China as well as Russia. So China takes advantage of the situation. With occupying Taiwan, China also gained control over ASML's chip factory, meaning China can now produce highly sophisticated microchips for its own military. It's a price NATO has to pay to keep Russia contained. Months pass, and the war seems to slow down. The entire world feels the effects of the war. The question then becomes not just whether NATO can win, but at what cost. A long war would be devastating for both sides, with millions of lives lost, economies shattered, and societies changed or even destroyed forever. In the end, while NATO may have the upper hand in many areas, the reality is that a war with Russia, especially with the looming shadow of nuclear weapons, is not something that anyone can truly win. Could NATO win a conventional war against Russia? Possibly, but a more important question might be, should we ever want to find out?